Hello CIS40A. In this video, I'm going to go over Unit 7 lecture, which is Chapter 7. And in this chapter, we're going to talk about configure router and switches. So in the chapter, it begins with talking about router and switches and Cisco devices have three modes. The first mode that you would see is the user exec mode. And this is when you first turn the router or the system on. And this mode is read only. There's no modification that can be done in this mode. And it's used to display settings. So you would see the little greater than symbol showing at the beginning. And that will be the user exec mode. The privilege mode, exec mode, allows some changes to the actual setting. However, you have to use this by using enable. So in order to get into the device, we want to make sure that we use enable command. And you would see the hashtag when it is in the privilege exec mode. Now, in order to configure the system to make changes like adding IP address, host name, and so on, we need to be in the global configuration mode. And to access this mode, we can simply use config term, which allows us to do configuration in the terminal, and that will be able to receive commands as you type in the various commands to configure the system. So this is, I'm using Packet Tracer, however, I would see this. So when you see the little greater sign, like this, what it says here, and this simulates just like a regular switch that you see. So here is my user exec mode. What we want to do is we want to go ahead and type in enable to go into the privilege exec mode. And if we want to configure here in the privilege exec mode, we can do like show interface. And that allows us to look at the type of interface that particular device has. This one, it will tell me that this has fast Ethernet. Okay. And then we can go press the arrow key to go down more and read more about that interface. Now, if we want to modify this switch, then what we want to do is we need to go config term, which allows us to now enter the configuration mode. So here is where you will be able to configure the particular switch. So we can say host name, and we can call this, let's say, site 1, switch 1. And after that, we can give it an IP address. 12.0.1, and we can say 255.0.0.0. In any case, so what you see here is that it's going to be that we can give it a host name configuration by using the hostname command. We can then, I forgot to do that, we can then configure the interface. So we would then go interface, and we can say, we can go back and look at its interface, fast Ethernet. So we can do F0-0. So let me exit out of this. And we want to show interface. And here it shows us the type of interface, so we can look at the interface and we would see that it has the O1 is down, the line protocol is down, is disabled. Then if we identify the interface, we can add in the IP address. Okay, so as you can see, my host name has been changed there. So in the first question, it asks you, when using Cisco router and managed switches, which mode is used to configure the device? You would, and how do you access such mode? You would go into global configuration after you enable to be in the privileged exec mode. So we want to enable first, and then we are going to go into config term. For number 2, it asks you, in the Cisco routers or end switches, which mode allows setting changes but cannot be used for configuration? How do you access such mode? So we want to use privileged exec mode, and we would use enable command in the user exec mode to enter the privileged exec mode. You can do enable to be able to enter the privileged exec mode. And for number 3, describe the purpose of the user exec mode in Cisco CLI. It's used to view device settings. You cannot change the settings in that mode. Number 4, how do you change the name of the Cisco router to Site1R1 on CLI? We would first access the global configuration mode by going from user exec mode, enable, to config term. Then we would use the command hostname Site1R1 to define the host name of that router. Now, you would see that you would have different interfaces. So we would have Ethernet, Fast Ethernet, and Gigabit Ethernet. The Fast Ethernet transfer at 0 to 10 megabit per second. Ethernet transfer at 0 to 10 megabit per second. Fast Ethernet transfer from 0 to 100 megabit per second. And Gigabit Ethernet transfer from 0 to 1000 megabit per second. The reason why we say 0 to 1000 for Gigabit Ethernet and the 0 to 100 for Fast Ethernet and 0 to 10 for Ethernet is that you know that your transfer rate is never going to be static, the same, consistent all the way through. Okay. All right. So going back to the notes, in the next part, it talks about different speed for your interface. And each type of interface is going to have different speeds. So when certain device would use certain type of interface, so we want to be able to specify the type of interface that we're using. So if I'm using Ethernet configuration, I can specify. In this case, we want to specify Fast Ethernet. The first interface that is Fast Ethernet. So we would use the command interface F0/0. If you want to go to the next interface, we would say F0/1 and so on. Then after we enter the interface, we would be able to set the address. So we would say IP address, and we can put down the IP address number. You can also add the subnet mask next to it. Now, if we want to configure description, you can specify the description, whichever you wanted to call that particular switch or include in that information that describe that switch. We can also specify the speed of the interface. So for example, we can say speed would be 100 or 10 or 1000. And then next we can configure the transmission over the channel. using half duplex, full duplex, or auto command. If you're using a serial port, then we want to say interface serial and which port it is. Whether it's the first one, that will be 0/0, the second, that will be 0/1, and so on. If you want to obtain the IP dynamically from the DHCP, we can then use IP address and DHCP command. We can also specify serial link encapsulation protocol by using encapsulation HDLC. And HDLC has two common protocol. I'm sorry, encapsulation has two common protocol, HDLC and PPP. So HDLC is known as High Data Link Control Protocol. This is Cisco proprietary protocol. It's used to connect from one Cisco device to another. PPP, point-to-point protocol, is an industry standard protocol. It's used across different vendor, different type of appliances, and this is used to support authentication. We can specify also the clock rate of the link. If the data communication equipment is at the end of the link, we have to specify the clock rate. And we can say clock rate and the number 64,000. After we're done, we want to enable the interface no shutdown, and that's going to allow us to enter the saving mode of the configuration. So to store the configuration, then we would copy the running configuration that we had set up to the startup config. So that way when it's the router or the switch boots the next time, it's going to use the configuration that you had set inside the system in command line. In our assignment in number 6, you're asked to provide the commands for different type of settings for your Cisco devices. For A, we want to set the IP address to 214.60 and 1 with the subnet mask. So we can say IP address, the IP, and then put in the IP number, and then put in the subnet mask as specified for A. For B, we would put in the description district LAN. Next, for C, we would put in the speed. We would say speed 1000. D, we want to put in the transmission as full duplex. We just type in the command full duplex. And that's pretty straightforward. It's very simple to use this. And again, in order to use these commands, you have to be in the configuration for terminal, and also you have to enable the interface by using the interface command and the specified interface. For question 7, it asks you which serial link encapsulation protocol is used to connect one Cisco device to another using back-to-back serial link, and that will be your HDLC protocol. This is Cisco proprietary protocol used to connect multiple devices that are Cisco. Question 8 asks you what command is used to enable the interface after the configuration is modified. We would enable the interface by using no shutdown. Then for 9, what command is used to modify settings and store that into the startup configuration of the device? We would use the command copy running config startup config. We're going to copy from running config to startup config so it can use it the next time it boots up. Let's go back to the notes and we're going to take a look at the type of configurations for different zones. So what we can do is we can set up our network into zones. Private LAN, that will be your internal network. Wireless, that would have wireless clients that are connecting through the wireless router to the private LAN. Wireless guest is a separate zone. It does not have access to private LAN, as it would be just a public wireless AP. DMZ is public server, DNS, SMTP, web server, database, and so on. Things that you can put into DMZ that will be public front, not going to have essential data, but you should also protect it. For the switch configuration, we would have the same process. You would enable, you would then go to config term in order to access the configuration. But switch core services have these tasks. It's used for address learning, filtering, loop avoidance. So address learning is a way for the switch to be able to learn all the MAC addresses for the connected system and the associated ports. Switch can be used to filter, as it would look at send data to only the ports that are associated with the destination of the MAC. And then loop avoidance uses spanning tree protocol, which is STP. It's used to reduce switch loops, so that way it can keep the bandwidth of the network in good standing. Because when you have loops, that can cause network interruption or it can crash the network. So the action can be performed on frame for a switch would be flooding, forwarding, and filtering. Flooding is when it's not able to see the MAC address, so it's going to send to everyone. Send the frame to all ports. Forward is when the switch knows the port and the destination, and it's going to send it to the destination, the frame. Filtering is it's going to filter the traffic and send only to the connected system. So those are the actions that can be performed on the switch. STP is an algorithm, and we know that it is a protocol, but it implements algorithm to determine the port that's used for looping, and it would take that and put it onto the blocking state, so that way loop doesn't occur. STP is also known as IEEE 802.1d. Make sure we know this for the Network Plus. And the algorithm takes 52 seconds to change the port from blocking state to the active forwarding state. So if you need to utilize that port, just keep in mind that it does take up to 52 seconds in order to do that. And it will be able to move through the all four state. Rstp, Rapid Spanning Tree Protocol, this is used, this is known as IEEE 802.1w. This is an improvement of STP. It has three-state blocking, listening, forwarding, and the alternative port is used for backup link, as backup link for forwarding. So if the port goes down, STP would then send information and trying to detect if the port is able to be associated with the MAC address. However, Rstp activate the port instead of using the voting process like STP. You will come across managed switch and unmanaged switch. Physically, you would see a console connection for the managed switch, and the unmanaged switch will not have that. The managed switch allows you to fully configure the interface, the port, the security, the VLANs, and so on. The unmanaged switch does not allow this configuration. It doesn't have that capability. To configure the port, we would similarly, just like the router, we would use the interface. So you would specify the interface and which interface that is. And you would use the same command from the router for description, speed, transmission, and routing. And we can disable the port by using shutdown command, and we can enable the port by using no shutdown. So other settings, port bonding like LACP, this is known as link aggregation. And this allows us to link multiple ports together on a switch to combine the bandwidth, so we would have a larger bandwidth. And link aggregation control protocol LACP. would be used, and the switch would have up to 48 ether channels. So let's go back to the assignment. We would answer the next question. For question 10, it asks you to describe 2 to 3 types of zones in a network. We would have a demilitarized zone, DMZ, that would contain public servers. We would have private LAN, that will be your internal network, your wireless, that can be divided into subzones that's connected to private LAN. For question 11, it asks you to explain the spanning tree STP, and make sure we know this for Network Plus certification, and how it's used for loop avoidance. So STP would place the ports that's involved loop onto a blocking state, and when the link goes down, the loop avoidance protocol will detect this and change the secondary pathway in the blocking state to forward again. For question 12, describe the switch actions that are used on a frame that will be flooding, forwarding, filtering. And flooding is to send all systems which destination MAC address is not known. Forwarding is when it knows the destination, it's going to forward the frame to the known system. Filter is a way that we can screen the traffic and only send the connected system. Now, comparing STP to Rstp for number 13, STP uses algorithm that determine the port that is created loop to be placed onto the blocking state. It is an IEEE 802.1d. Algorithm does take 52 seconds to change from blocking state to forwarding state. Rstp would then move 4 states: blocking, listening, learning, and forwarding. So there's additional one additional state. And rapid spanning tree protocol, your Rstp is known as 802.1w, and it is an improvement of STP. There are 3 states in the STP, whereas Rstp uses 4 states. Alternative port is used for backup and for forwarding. So when the port goes down, Rstp activate the port instead of using the voting process like STP. We saw that earlier. For 14, it asks you to explain the difference between managed switch and an unmanaged switch. Managed switch means that you can configure different areas of the switch, and unmanaged switch does not have the capability for configuration. Now let's switch back to the notes, and we are going to continue with the rest, where we would start looking into other settings. So on the switch, we would have port bonding through LACP, and this is also known as link aggregation. So multiple ports can be combined together for more bandwidth, and so we would then be able to aggregate those ports. So to configure link aggregation for port 11 and 12 as ether channel on the gigabit Ethernet, we would place the ports on VLAN 2, assign it ether channel 5, and this is what you would get. So first we would do config term or configure terminal. We would then use interface range gigabit Ethernet 0/11 for port 11 to 12. And since this is a switch, the next line would be switch port. So here is where we would put that we would access the switch that we had specified the interface for. So switch port mode access, then we would then access VLAN 2. So using switch port, we can also state access VLAN and the number which identified the VLAN that we set up for port 11 and 12. Then we would say channel group 5 mode active. So these are the commands that you are expected to know in general for Network Plus, but if you are pursuing Cisco certification, you have to know this very well. Now, what if we want to set an IP address for VLAN? We would say enable config term interface VLAN 1 IP address and give it an IP address and a subnet mask. And we would lastly make sure that we enable that interface so we can say no shutdown. And we can exit. So after we exit the configuration mode, we will be able to show for, statistic, configured settings, and so on. Now we know that most routers act as the default gateway, so we can safely say that we can use a router IP for this particular answer. So we can enable the command or enable the privilege exec mode and then go into the global configuration mode, and then we can specify the default gateway using the IP. Now, some switches would have power over the Ethernet, which allows you to use that port as a power source as well. And power over the Ethernet plus, PoE, is just the same thing with higher wattage. So the regular power over the Ethernet, it uses 15, or it's able to handle 15.4 watts, where power over the Ethernet plus, PoE plus, it uses a different protocol and or the different standards, and it would receive at 25.5 watts over the Ethernet cable. So to configure LAN, we want to configure all ports that are default to VLAN. We can create additional VLANs to what is already defaulted. And VLAN mode is activated when we are accessing the VLAN database. So to make a VLAN, we would start with enable. We would then go to config T. And we would then use the command VLAN database to open that up. And then we would want to name our VLAN. So VLAN 2 and 3 are named marketing and engineering. Then after that, we would do an exit. So to place a port on the VLAN, we would use interface and we would use switch port access VLAN command. So enable config, we would then can group a number of physical ports on the switch and group them into one VLAN. So we can say port 2 to port 4 on VLAN 2 and port 9 to port 12 on VLAN 3. So you can divide up the logical ports that way and group them from the physical connection to the logical side. Trunking is a feature that allows the switch to connect to another switch, which assigns the port and the responsibility, or port responsible for the connection. The trunk port carries the VLAN packets from one router to the next. So we need to make sure that we set up the trunk port if we're using VLAN. There are two protocols that are used for tagging, and in order for VLAN traffic to pass from one switch to another, a switch must tag the frame to use the VLAN ID. Otherwise, the other switch has to use another VLAN ID. And Interswitch Isl, we touch on this. This is a Cisco proprietary protocol that's used for tagging packets and associating them. 802.1Q, which is a newer Cisco HP Jupyter switches, and so on. VLAN trunking protocol is called VTP. This is proprietary to Cisco. It creates a list of VLAN on the switch and places that list into another switch, so that way it can share that across. It's a way that we can streamline the VLAN's creation on many switches. So let's come back to the assignment. We can start answering some next questions now. For question 615, it asks you to configure the VLAN IP with 12.0.0.3. We would enable, go into config terminal. We would say interface VLAN 2, IP address, and we would say 12.0.0.3 255.0.0.0, and then no shutdown and exit. So that way the interface is enabled. For 16, what is the command to configure the default gateway IP address 112.0.0.1? That will be, we simply use the command IP default gateway and put in the IP address. And you can follow that up with the subnet mask. For 17, what is the main difference between PoE and PoE plus? That it's just the power, the wattage is higher on the PoE plus, which is 25.5 watts, compared to the PoE, which is 15.4 watts. For 18, provide the commands that create VLAN 4 name finance department. We would enable VLAN database VLAN 4 name finance department, and we would then exit. That would enable the information for the VLAN. So anytime that you create VLAN, you have to start with VLAN database. 19, provide the commands to place ports 5 through 8 of a switch onto a VLAN 4. So we would start with enable, then go to config term, then we would start the interface 5 through 8, so F0, 5 to 8. And then we would do a switch port access VLAN 4 to turn on the VLAN 4. And then we would exit, and then we would show VLAN. And it would include all the VLAN information, including VLAN 4. Next question asks you, what protocol is used to create a list of VLANs from one switch and transfer the list to another switch? That is called the VLAN trunking protocol, your VTP. For 21, provide the command that configures the native VLAN 2. That will be your switch port trunk native VLAN 2. Very straightforward. So switch port trunk native VLAN 2. And if we want the command to force login on the switch, we would use login local. So let's come back to the notes and finish up the rest of this. In the next section of the notes, it talks about port mirroring. This is also known as port monitoring. It's a way that we can copy the data that reaches a certain port to another port. It would specify the port, and we need to specify the port that receives the data when we do the port mirroring. Port security allows us to enable the port and specify the MAC address of the system. We can only use one address per port. And in switch management, we can use virtual terminal authentication. We can configure the console port, such as we would enable configure terminal. We would do a line con, that will be your console port. And then we can force login with using login local. If we want to log in to 5 telnet ports, we would say line VTY 0 through 4, because 0 through 4 is going to give you 5 telnet ports. So in troubleshooting, we would check, especially level 1 and 2 switch, we would check switching loop, bad cable, port configuration, VLAN management, mismatch MTU or MTU black hole, power failure, bad modules. When we're using layer 3 and up switch, we would check bad or missing routes, wrong subnet mask, wrong gateway, duplicate IP address, or wrong DNS. So those are some of the troubleshooting things that we want to be able to use in case that we have issues with our switches. So for 23, when troubleshooting L3 plus switch, what should you check? When there's a communication issue, we should check bad or missing route, wrong subnet mask, wrong gateway, duplicate IP address, or wrong DNS. This is a fairly short chapter. I encourage you to use Packet Tracer to practice the programming of your routers and switches. You might want to connect them and then set them up. Make sure that, if you're using, IP addresses like IPv4, we want to make sure that we set up the way in which your subnet is working accordingly. You can keep them all on the same network, like your router is going to be .1 and your switch can be .2 and your server can be .3 and so on. And go into CLI and see if you can practice some of the commands that we talk about in this week. And I encourage you to do that so that way you will have more exposure. And we will try to address some of that in Packet Tracer in the next few sessions, and we will get our physical switch and router working as we would fix the driver issues, and I'm working on that. Thank you for watching this video. This concludes my Unit 7 lecture. Let me know if you have any questions or any concern, and make sure that we submit the assignments when we complete the assignments on campus.